The cook was fired for theft, and the restaurant owner asked her a question. Her answer left the owner paralyzed. The rising sun painted the Bayview sky in shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the calm waters of the Pacific. This small coastal town in California was slowly waking up, the streets still empty except for a few early bird fishermen and shop owners opening their doors. In the heart of town, a wooden sign gently swayed in the sea breeze, Seabreeze. The restaurant, with its large windows and red brick facade, was more than just a place to eat. It was the community's gathering spot, where stories were shared, friendships formed, and traditions kept alive. Eleanor Thompson, a 50-year-old woman with gray hair and determined eyes, unlocked the back door of Seabreeze. Her steps echoed in the empty kitchen as she turned on the lights and began her daily routine. The lines on her face told the story of a life not devoid of challenges, but her eyes sparkled with the strength of someone who had faced storms and survived. As Eleanor checked the supplies, the door opened again. Maria Gonzalez, the 45-year-old chef, entered with a warm smile. "Good morning, Eleanor," she called, her Mexican accent soft but noticeable. "Good morning, Maria," Eleanor responded, returning the smile. The two women had worked side by side for over a decade, and Seabreeze was as much Maria's dream as it was Eleanor's. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the restaurant came to life. The aroma of fresh bread and coffee mixed with the salty scent of the sea. The first customers arrived, fishermen weary from a night at sea, teachers on their way to school, retirees seeking company. "Eleanor," Maria called from the kitchen, "I think we could change up the menu a bit. How about we add my new fish dish?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know, Maria. Our customers like consistency." A slight frown crossed Maria's face, but she nodded and went back to work. The day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor moved among the tables, chatting with customers, many of whom she knew by name. Seabreeze buzzed with conversation and laughter. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor retreated to her small office in the back. Sitting at her worn desk, she opened the ledger. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and a crease of worry formed on her forehead. Something wasn't right. Small amounts were missing, not a lot, but enough to notice. Eleanor furrowed her brow, her mind racing through possibilities. Could it be a mistake? Or something more sinister? She looked out the office window, watching Maria work efficiently in the kitchen. A knot formed in her stomach. No, she thought, shaking her head. Not Maria. Never Maria. But the seed of doubt had been planted. When the last customer left and the doors were locked, Eleanor and Maria sat down for their customary end-of-night cup of tea. "It was a good day," Maria said, smiling tiredly. Eleanor nodded, but her mind was on the discrepancies in the ledger. "Yes, it was," she replied absently. Maria noticed Eleanor's distraction. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Eleanor forced a smile. "Of course, just tired." As they said goodbye and stepped out into the cool Bayview night, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The trust she had always had in Maria, the friendship they shared, suddenly seemed to be on shaky ground. What had once been as solid as the rocks on the Bayview coast now seemed as uncertain as the shifting sands of the beach. Eleanor looked up at the starry sky, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at Seabreeze earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, and the streets of Bayview were silent. With a heavy heart, she sat at her desk and opened the ledger again. The numbers didn't lie. Small amounts continued to be missing, forming a pattern over the past few months. Eleanor sighed, running her hand through her gray hair. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there, black and white. As she reviewed the accounts, her mind wandered to the past. She remembered the day she opened Seabreeze, shortly after her husband John's death. The restaurant had been their dream, and she was determined to realize it, even alone. The first years were tough. Sleepless nights, constant financial worries, and the struggle to establish Seabreeze as part of the Bayview community. But she persevered, driven by John's memory and the desire to create something lasting. A noise at the back door brought her back to the present. It was Jake, her 22-year-old nephew, arriving for his shift as cashier. "Good morning, Aunt Elle," he said, yawning. Eleanor noticed the dark circles under his eyes and his tired appearance. Jake had been different lately, more distant. "Good morning, Jake," she replied, forcing a smile. "Are you okay?" Jake shrugged. "Just tired. Long night studying." Eleanor nodded, not entirely convinced. She watched Jake prepare the cash register for the day, her mind still on the financial discrepancies. As the day progressed, Eleanor closely watched every movement in the kitchen and at the cash register. Her eyes followed Maria as she moved gracefully through the kitchen, preparing dishes that made customers return day after day. Maria noticed Eleanor's gaze. "Is something wrong?" she asked during a quiet moment. Eleanor hesitated. "No, nothing," she lied, feeling guilty for her suspicions. In the afternoon, Eleanor called Jake into her office. "Jake, have you noticed anything odd with the cash register lately?" Jake looked nervous. "No, Aunt Elle." "Why?" "Just checking," Eleanor replied, studying her nephew's face. The hours passed, and Eleanor's suspicions grew. Each time Maria or Jake approached the cash register, her heart tightened. Finally, after closing, Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. She asked Maria to stay after everyone had left. "Maria, we need to talk," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly. Maria nodded, looking confused. "Of course, what's up?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "There have been discrepancies in the cash register. Small amounts missing." Maria's eyes widened. "What? How?" "I've checked several times," Eleanor continued, her voice growing firmer. "Money is missing, Maria. And you're one of the only people who have access to the cash register besides me and Jake." Maria's face paled. "Eleanor, you can't be thinking. I would never steal from you. Never. I want to believe you, Maria. But the evidence." "What evidence?" Maria interrupted, her voice rising. "I've dedicated my life to this place, just as much as you have." Eleanor felt tears in her eyes. "I know, and that's why this hurts so much. But I can't ignore the facts." Maria stood up, trembling with anger and hurt. "After all these years, you don't trust me? How can you think I would do this?" "Maria, please, if you're having financial troubles, we can talk. I didn't steal anything." Maria shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe you think this of me." Eleanor felt her heart break, but she remained firm. "I'm sorry, Maria. But I can't take the risk. You're fired." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria looked at Eleanor as if she were a stranger. "You'll regret this, Eleanor," Maria finally said, her voice low and trembling. "You're making a terrible mistake." With that, Maria walked out of the kitchen, leaving Eleanor alone with her doubts and her broken heart. Outside, the lights of Bayview twinkled in the night, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside Seabreeze. Eleanor sank into a chair, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The news of Maria's dismissal spread through Bayview like wildfire. In a small town, secrets have a short life, and soon everyone knew about the theft accusation against the beloved chef of Seabreeze. Maria woke up the next morning with the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her husband, Carlos, gave her a tight hug before heading to his job at the local factory. "It'll be all right, my love," he whispered, but Maria could hear the worry in his voice. Determined to clear her name, Maria set out in search of a new job. But at every door she knocked, she encountered suspicious looks and vague excuses. At Lola's cafe, the owner looked at her with pity. "I'm sorry, Maria, but I can't take the risk. You understand, don't you?" At Mr. Giovanni's Italian restaurant, the response was even harsher. "We don't hire thieves here," he said, slamming the door in Maria's face. With each rejection, Maria felt her heart sink further. The town she considered her home now treated her like a pariah. Meanwhile, at Seabreeze, Eleanor faced her own battles. Maria's absence was felt in every dish that came out of the kitchen. The customers noticed the difference. "The fish isn't as good as it used to be," commented Mr. Thompson, a regular customer. "Where's Maria?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "Nobody makes a paella like her." Eleanor smiled politely and offered vague excuses, but inside, doubt ate away at her. Had she made a terrible mistake? Jake watched everything with a distant look, his hands trembling slightly as he operated the cash register. At night, Maria returned home exhausted and disheartened. Her sons, 16-year-old Miguel and 12-year-old Lucas, anxiously awaited news. "Did you find a job today, Mom?" asked Lucas, his big brown eyes full of hope. Maria forced a smile. "Not yet, Mijo. But tomorrow will be better." While preparing dinner with the few ingredients they had in the pantry, Maria noticed Lucas coughing. It wasn't the first time that week. "Are you okay, Lucas?" she asked, placing her hand on her son's forehead. Lucas nodded, but Maria noticed he was warmer than usual. A new worry joined the many that already weighed on her heart. Days turned into weeks. Maria continued her fruitless job search, while Seabreeze struggled to maintain its standards without its star chef. Eleanor hired a new chef, a young man fresh out of culinary school. But his elaborate and pretentious dishes did not please the simple palates of the Bayview residents. "This isn't real food," complained old fisherman Joe, pushing his plate of Mediterranean fusion with Asian touches away. Empty tables became an increasingly common sight at Seabreeze. Eleanor spent sleepless nights, worried about the future of the restaurant she and John had dreamed of together. Jake, for his part, seemed more and more nervous and jittery. Eleanor caught him several times dozing off at work or disappearing for long periods. "Is everything all right, Jake?" she asked one day, concerned. "Sure, Aunt Elle. Just haven't been sleeping well," he replied, avoiding her gaze. At the Gonzalez home, the situation worsened by the day. Lucas's cough intensified, and now he had a fever almost every night. "We need to take him to the doctor," insisted Carlos. Maria agreed, though the thought of medical bills made her nauseous. Without her salary from Seabreeze, every penny counted. At Dr. Peterson's office, the diagnosis was worrying. "Lucas has a serious respiratory infection," the doctor explained. "He needs antibiotics and possibly some tests." Maria felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. How would they pay for all this? Back at Seabreeze, Eleanor was checking the accounts when she noticed something strange. The discrepancies in the cash register continued, even after Maria's departure. Her stomach tightened with a mix of confusion and guilt. That night, two women on opposite sides of Bayview faced sleepless nights. Maria, worried about Lucas's health and the mounting bills. Eleanor, tormented by the possibility that she had made a terrible mistake. Dawn brought a new day, but for Maria and Eleanor, the shadows of the night seemed to linger, reminding them of the high cost of distrust and hasty decisions. Seabreeze, once the pulsating heart of Bayview, now seemed like a ghost of its former self. Eleanor, with deep circles under her eyes and slumped shoulders, watched yet another meal being returned to the kitchen. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," said Sarah, the waitress, with a look of pity. "Mr. Johnson said the fish is too dry." Eleanor sighed, running her hand through her graying hair. It was the third chef she had hired since Maria's departure, and none of them could capture the magic that the former chef brought to the kitchen. "Chef Anton," Eleanor called, entering the kitchen. "We need to talk." The young chef, with his tall hat and arrogant expression, barely looked at her. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson?" "The complaints are increasing. We need to simplify the menu, go back to the roots of Seabreeze." Anton huffed. "With all due respect, ma'am, my cooking is art. I cannot compromise my vision." Eleanor felt her frustration grow. "Your vision is driving our loyal customers away." After a heated discussion, Eleanor found herself, once again, without a chef. Anton stormed out, leaving behind a chaotic kitchen and a restaurant on the brink of collapse. Alone in her office, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of weakness. Silent tears streamed down her face as memories flooded her mind. She remembered the day Maria arrived, years ago, bringing with her family recipes and a warm smile. How the two had worked side by side, turning Seabreeze into the heart of the community. "Oh, John," she whispered to the photo of her late husband on the wall. "What if I've made a terrible mistake?" Across town, Maria faced her own battle. Lucas, now constantly feverish, slept restlessly on the worn sofa in the living room. Medical bills piled up on the kitchen table, a constant reminder of their desperate situation. "Mom," called Miguel, entering the kitchen. "I can get a job after school. Help with the bills." Maria felt her heart tighten. "No, Mijo. Your education comes first. We'll find a way." But as she spoke those words, Maria wondered how exactly they would find a way. Each day brought new expenses, and their savings were nearly depleted. Back at Seabreeze, Eleanor noticed Jake acting even stranger than usual. He seemed nervous, always looking over his shoulder, his hands trembling slightly as he operated the cash register. "Jake," she called, approaching her nephew. "Are you okay? You seem tense." Jake forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "All good, Aunt Elle. Just a bit tired, you know." But Eleanor was not convinced. There was something in Jake's eyes, a shadow she couldn't decipher. That night, after closing, Eleanor decided to check the cash register again. To her surprise and horror, the discrepancies continued. Small amounts were still missing, even with Maria gone. A knot formed in her stomach. If it wasn't Maria, then who? Her eyes wandered to the door through which Jake had left earlier, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in her mind. Meanwhile, at the Gonzalez home, Maria made a painful decision. "Carlos," she said, her voice trembling, "I think we should consider leaving Bayview." Carlos looked at her, shocked. "Leave? But this is our home, Maria." "I know," she replied, tears in her eyes. "But there's no work for me here. And Lucas needs treatment we can't afford. Maybe in a bigger city." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with sadness and resignation. Back at Seabreeze, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Maria's words echoed in her mind. "You will regret this, Eleanor. You are making a terrible mistake." What if it was true? What if she had misjudged the situation, destroying not just a precious friendship but also the future of the restaurant? The next morning, Eleanor arrived early at Seabreeze, determined to uncover the truth. She began meticulously reviewing all transactions from the past months, looking for a pattern, a clue, anything that could shed light on the mystery. Then she noticed something. The discrepancies always occurred on specific days, days when Jake worked alone at the cash register. Eleanor's heart raced. It couldn't be. Not her nephew, not Jake. But the evidence was there, impossible to ignore. At that moment, Jake entered the restaurant, looking paler and more agitated than ever. "Jake," Eleanor called, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." The young man froze, his face a mask of fear and guilt. And in that instant, Eleanor knew. She had made a terrible mistake, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The sun had barely risen when Eleanor opened the doors of Seabreeze. The restaurant, once a beacon of comfort and community, now seemed like an empty shell. The tables, once full of laughter and conversation, remained silent, covered in a thin layer of dust. Eleanor walked slowly through the kitchen, her fingers lightly brushing the hanging utensils. Each touch brought memories of delicious dishes, satisfied customers, a time when everything seemed possible. Now, those memories tasted bitter. Sitting in her office, Eleanor stared at the stack of unpaid bills. Seabreeze was on the verge of bankruptcy. Without Maria's culinary magic, the customers had disappeared, taking the soul of the restaurant with them. "John," she whispered to the photo of her late husband, "what have I done?" At that moment, Eleanor made a decision. She needed to find Maria. Not just for the sake of Seabreeze, but to correct the terrible mistake she had made. Across town, Maria woke up to another day of uncertainty. Lucas's cough echoed through the small house, a constant reminder of the urgency of their situation. "How is he?" asked Carlos, his voice laden with worry. Maria shook her head. "The fever won't go down. We need more medicine, but—" Her voice faltered, the unspoken words weighing in the air. They had no money. With renewed determination, Eleanor grabbed her car keys and headed toward the neighborhood where she knew Maria lived. Each block she passed seemed to increase the weight on her heart. How would she ask for forgiveness? How would she explain her mistake? Finally, she arrived. Maria's house was small, with peeling paint and a neglected garden. Eleanor hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. The door opened slowly, revealing Maria. Eleanor barely recognized her. The vibrant, lively woman she had known seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. Her eyes, once bright, were now dull and surrounded by deep dark circles. "Eleanor?" Maria's voice was a mix of surprise and caution. "Maria, Eleanor began, but was interrupted by a coughing fit from inside the house. Maria immediately turned around. "Lucas." "Coming, Mijo." Without thinking, Eleanor followed Maria inside. The interior of the house was simple but clean. On the living room sofa, wrapped in a worn blanket, was Lucas. The boy trembled, his pale face glistening with sweat. "Oh, Maria," Eleanor whispered, the reality of the situation hitting her like a punch to the stomach. Maria dampened a cloth in the basin next to the sofa and placed it on Lucas's forehead. Her movements were automatic, as if she had done this hundreds of times in the past few days. Eleanor watched, feeling like an intruder. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by Lucas's labored breathing. Finally, Maria turned to face her. "Why are you here, Eleanor?" The question hung in the air, loaded with months of pain and betrayal. Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes. "Maria, She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I made a terrible mistake. A mistake that cost us all dearly." Maria crossed her arms, her face a mix of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. Eleanor took a deep breath and continued, "The money, the discrepancies at the cash register. It wasn't you. It never was you." Maria's eyes widened in understanding. "Then why," she began, but her voice broke. "Why did you do this, Maria?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you steal from me after all these years?" The silence that followed was deafening. Maria looked at Eleanor, her eyes filling with tears. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I never stole from you, Eleanor. The money that was missing, I was using it to buy better, fresher ingredients. I wanted Seabreeze to be the best, even if it meant sacrificing my own salary. I love that place like it's my own." The words hit Eleanor like a bolt of lightning. Her legs weakened, and she fell to her knees, the weight of the truth crushing her. "Oh, God," she sobbed, tears now flowing freely. "Maria, I messed up everything." Maria knelt beside Eleanor, her own anger melting away in the face of her former friend and boss's evident pain. "I should have trusted you," Eleanor continued, between sobs. "I should have asked, should have." "Shoo," Maria soothed, placing a hesitant hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "It's done now." The two women remained like that for a long moment, united in their grief and regret. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo the lost time, the missed opportunities. Finally, Eleanor looked up, meeting Maria's gaze. "Can we fix this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Is there any chance we can go back?" Maria looked at Lucas, still trembling on the sofa, and then back at Eleanor. Her face was a complex mix of emotions: hurt, hope, fear, determination. I don't know, Eleanor, she replied honestly. But for Lucas, for Seabreeze, maybe it's worth trying. The silence following the conversation between Eleanor and Maria was broken by the sound of Eleanor's cell phone. She picked it up with trembling hands, seeing Jake's name flashing on the screen. Sorry, I need to take this, she said to Maria, who nodded silently. Jake? What's wrong? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Aunt Elle, I need to tell you something. Jake's voice sounded broken, almost unrecognizable. Eleanor felt her heart tighten. Jake, what happened? I can't take it anymore, Aunt. It was me. I was the one who stole the money from Seabreeze. Jake's words confirmed Eleanor's suspicions, but hearing the confession aloud was like a punch to the stomach. She looked at Maria, who watched with concern. Jake, where are you? Stay there, I'm coming to you, Eleanor said, hanging up the phone. Turning to Maria, Eleanor quickly explained the situation. Maria, I need to go. Jake confessed. He's the one who stole the money. Maria was stunned, the implications of this sinking in. Go, she said simply. Take care of him. Eleanor rushed to her car, her mind spinning with the revelations of the last few minutes. As she drove to Jake's apartment, memories flooded her mind. Jake is a child, laughing and running around Seabreeze. Jake is a teenager, helping on weekends. When had things gone so wrong? Arriving at Jake's building, Eleanor climbed the stairs 2 at a time. She knocked on the door, calling her nephew's name. Jake opened the door, his eyes red and swollen from crying. Aunt Elle, I'm so sorry. I really am. Eleanor entered, closing the door behind her. The apartment was a mess, with clothes scattered and empty bottles everywhere. Jake, what happened? Why did you do this? Eleanor asked, her voice a mix of disappointment and concern. Jake collapsed on the sofa, covering his face with his hands. I started using drugs. At first, it was just occasionally, at parties. But then I couldn't stop. Eleanor sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Oh, Jake, I needed money to buy more. I started taking a little here, a little there. I thought no one would notice, Jake continued, sobbing. But then the debt got bigger, and the guy started threatening me. I didn't know what to do. Eleanor felt tears running down her own face. How had she not noticed? How had she let things get to this point? Jake, why didn't you tell me? I could have helped, she said softly. Jake lifted his face, his eyes full of shame. I was afraid. Afraid of disappointing you, of admitting I had failed. And then, when you accused Maria, I panicked. I knew I should tell the truth, but I was so scared. Eleanor pulled Jake into a tight hug, feeling her nephew's body shake with sobs. We'll fix this, Jake. Together. But first, we need to right the wrongs we've done. Meanwhile, back at Maria's house, Lucas had woken up and was sitting on the sofa, still pale, but a bit more alert. Mommy, who was that lady? He asked, his voice hoarse. Maria sat next to her son, running her hand through his sweaty hair. That was Eleanor, Mijo. My former boss at Seabreeze. The one who accused you of stealing? Lucas asked, furrowing his brow. Maria sighed. Yes, but things are complicated, Mijo. Sometimes, people make mistakes, even when they have good intentions. Lucas coughed, and Maria quickly offered him a glass of water. As the boy drank, she couldn't help but think about Eleanor and Jake. The anger she had felt for so long was starting to give way to a complex mix of emotions: compassion, sadness, and even a little hope. Back at Jake's apartment, Eleanor was helping her nephew pack a bag. You're going to stay with me for a while, she said firmly. We're going to get you into a rehab center. We'll get through this together, Jake. Jake nodded, tears still streaming down his face. Aunt Elle, what about Seabreeze? And Maria? I messed up everything. Eleanor took a deep breath. Yes, Jake, you made a grave mistake. But I did too. I accused an innocent person without solid evidence. Now, we have to do whatever we can to fix things. As they packed, Eleanor called Maria. Maria? Sorry to call so late. We need to talk. About everything. Could you come to Seabreeze tomorrow morning? There was a pause on the other line before Maria responded, Yes, Eleanor. I'll be there. Hanging up the phone, Eleanor looked at Jake, who looked small and frightened, so different from the confident young man she knew. Tomorrow will be a new day, she said, both to Jake and to herself. A day to start mending our mistakes. That night, in different parts of Bayview, 3 tormented souls struggled to sleep. Eleanor, consumed by guilt and determined to set things right. Jake, facing the demons of his addiction and the consequences of his actions. And Maria, torn between the hurt of the past and the possibility of a reconciled future. Dawn would bring not just a new day, but a chance for redemption, forgiveness, and perhaps a new beginning for them all. The sun had barely risen when Eleanor opened the doors of Seabreeze. The air still carried the scent of fresh coffee and newly baked bread, a reminder of better days. She sighed, looking around the empty restaurant, waiting for Maria's arrival. The doorbell rang, and Maria entered, hesitant. Her eyes swept over the place, filled with memories and conflicting emotions. Thank you for coming, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Maria nodded, sitting down at a nearby table. What did you want to tell me, Eleanor? Eleanor took a deep breath. It was time for the truth. Maria, I made a terrible mistake. Jake confessed that it was he who stole the money. He has a drug problem. Maria was silent for a moment, processing the information. And now, she finally asked. Now, Eleanor began, I want to make things right. Clear your name publicly. Offer you your job back, if you'll accept it. The words hung in the air, loaded with hope and apprehension. Maria looked out the window, thoughtful. It's not that simple, Eleanor. Trust was broken. The whole town saw me as a thief. At that moment, the door opened again. It was Mayor Thompson, followed by some local residents. Eleanor had invited them for an important meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor began, her voice slightly trembling, I called you here to make a public confession and apology. The next few minutes were intense. Eleanor explained the mistake, exonerating Maria from any blame. There were murmurs of surprise and disbelief among those present. Maria, Eleanor said, turning to her, I asked for forgiveness. Not just on my behalf, but on behalf of all Bayview. All eyes turned to Maria, who seemed to struggle with her own emotions. I need time, she finally said. In the days that followed, the news spread throughout the town. Some people approached Maria to apologize, while others still looked at her with suspicion. At Seabreeze, Eleanor struggled to keep things running. The customers were still few, and those who came often asked about Maria. Is she coming back? Was a frequent question. Eleanor could only answer, I hope so. Meanwhile, Jake began his treatment. The first weeks were tough, with withdrawal crises and moments of weakness. Eleanor visited him regularly, offering support and unconditional love. Maria, on her own, faced her battle. Lucas's health slowly improved, but the bills continued to pile up. She found herself looking at the phone, considering calling Eleanor, but always hesitated at the last moment. The path to redemption was proving arduous and filled with obstacles. But in Bayview, small steps were being taken towards healing and forgiveness. Autumn had arrived in Bayview, bringing with it cold winds and golden leaves. At Seabreeze, Eleanor looked out the window, her mind working furiously. She knew she needed to do something to help Maria and, at the same time, bring the community back together. That's when the idea struck, a charity dinner. Not just to raise funds for Lucas's medical expenses, but also to show Bayview the true spirit of community they had always had. With a racing heart, Eleanor picked up the phone and called Maria. After a few rings, Maria's hesitant voice answered. "Hello? Maria, it's Eleanor. I had an idea and I'd like to discuss it with you. Can we meet?" There was a pause on the other side of the line before Maria responded, "Okay." "In the park, in an hour?" An hour later, the two women met at Bayview's Central Park. Eleanor excitedly explained her idea for the charity dinner. "We could use Seabreeze, invite the whole town. All proceeds would go to Lucas's medical expenses. What do you think?" Maria listened silently, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. When Eleanor finished, she shook her head slowly. "No, Eleanor. I appreciate the intention, but I can't accept." "But why?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "It feels like charity. Or worse, a way for you to alleviate your guilt," Maria responded, her voice tense. "I don't want to be a charity project for this town." Eleanor felt her heart sink. "It's not like that, Maria. It's about the community coming together, about us doing the right thing." But Maria remained firm. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. The answer is no." In the days that followed, Eleanor refused to give up on the idea. She began making calls, trying to organize the event even without Maria's approval. However, obstacles soon began to emerge. Local suppliers, still hesitant due to the recent controversy, were reluctant to get involved. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," said Mr. Johnson, the local seafood supplier. "But I can't risk my reputation at this time." Longtime customers of Seabreeze also expressed their doubts. "A charity dinner?" "I don't know, Eleanor," commented Mrs. Patel, a regular customer. "Things still seem a bit complicated." To make matters worse, Jake, who was in recovery, heard about the planned event and panicked. Fearing that his involvement in the theft would be publicly exposed, he began to secretly sabotage Eleanor's efforts. Mysterious calls canceling reservations, rumors spread around town about the quality of the food at Seabreeze, all were the work of Jake, consumed by fear and guilt. The community of Bayview remained divided. Some saw the dinner as an opportunity for healing, others as a transparent attempt by Eleanor to clean up her image. Frustrated but determined, Eleanor decided to make one last attempt to convince Maria. She went to the Gonzalez's house, finding Maria in the front garden. "Maria, please reconsider," Eleanor pleaded. "This dinner could do a lot of good, not just for Lucas, but for the entire community." Maria turned, her eyes flashing with anger. "Don't you understand, Eleanor? It's not just about the money. It's about dignity, about trust. You broke that, and now you expect to fix everything with a dinner?" The argument quickly escalated, years of hurt and resentment coming to the surface. "I'm trying to do the right thing," Eleanor shouted, tears in her eyes. "Too late," Maria retorted. "You should have thought of that before accusing me, before destroying my reputation." The argument drew the attention of neighbors, who discreetly watched from their windows and gardens. "The dinner is canceled," Maria finally declared, her voice cold. "I want no part of it." Eleanor stood there, stunned, as Maria walked back into her house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed down the quiet street, symbolizing the apparent end of their hopes for reconciliation. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the empty Seabreeze, staring at the half-finished posters for the charity dinner. Everything seemed to have gone wrong. The town was still divided, Maria was still hurt, and now the only plan she had to fix things had fallen apart. Across town, Maria lay in bed, unable to sleep. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind, mixed with her own conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to forgive, to believe in Eleanor's sincerity. But the other part, the part that was wounded and betrayed, couldn't let go of the hurt. In his apartment, Jake trembled, consumed by guilt for his recent actions. He knew he was only making things worse, but fear prevented him from confessing. Bayview, once a united town, now seemed irrevocably fragmented. The charity dinner, meant to be a bridge to reconciliation, had become yet another point of contention. The day of the charity dinner dawned with palpable tension in the air of Bayview. Despite Maria's previous objections, Eleanor decided to go ahead with the event, hoping that somehow it could be the catalyst for the healing the community so desperately needed. At Seabreeze, Eleanor worked frantically, arranging tables and checking the final preparations. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cutlery, the weight of the night ahead weighing on her shoulders. Unexpectedly, the door opened. It was Jake, looking pale and nervous. "Aunt Elle," he said, his voice shaky, "I need to talk to you." Before Eleanor could respond, the first guests began to arrive. The tension in the air was almost palpable, with curious looks and whispers circulating around the room. While Eleanor greeted the guests, Jake stepped up onto the small makeshift stage. With trembling hands, he picked up the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," his voice echoed through the restaurant, silencing the crowd. I have something to confess." What followed was an emotional and detailed confession. Jake revealed everything: his drug addiction, the theft of money, his recent sabotage of Eleanor's efforts. With each word, the shock was visible on the faces of those present. Eleanor, paralyzed by surprise, watched the scene unfold. Her eyes met Maria's, who had just entered the restaurant, drawn by the commotion. When Jake finished, sobbing and asking for forgiveness, a heavy silence fell over Seabreeze. It was Maria who broke it, walking slowly to the stage. "Jake," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle, "thank you for your courage." Turning to the stunned crowd, Maria continued, "We all make mistakes. We all judge too quickly at times. But what defines us are not our mistakes, but how we choose to correct them." Eleanor, with tears in her eyes, joined Maria on the stage. "Maria is right," she said. "This dinner is not just about raising funds. It's about forgiveness, about rebuilding our community." The two women, side by side, shared their stories: the misunderstandings, the pain, but also the hope for reconciliation. With each word, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, the tension giving way to a collective understanding. When they finished, hesitant applause began, growing into an emotional ovation. Tears were visible on many faces. Maria, in a symbolic gesture, headed to the kitchen. Minutes later, she emerged with a dish not on the planned menu, a unique fusion of her favorite dishes with Eleanor's, a culinary representation of their shared journey. As the guests savored the meal, conversations flowed freely. Old grievances were openly discussed, apologies were offered and accepted. The community of Bayview, so divided for so long, began slowly to heal. At the end of the night, Eleanor and Maria found themselves alone in the kitchen of Seabreeze. "So," Eleanor began hesitantly, "what happens now?" Maria smiled, tired but hopeful. "Now, Eleanor, we start over. Together." The two women embraced, years of pain and misunderstandings finally giving way to forgiveness and hope. In the months that followed, Bayview witnessed a transformation. Seabreeze flourished again, with Eleanor and Maria working side by side. Jake, with support from the community, continued his recovery, becoming an example of redemption. 1 year after the charity dinner, Seabreeze was bustling with life. Old and new customers crowded the tables, savoring not just the delicious food but also the renewed sense of community. In the kitchen, Eleanor and Maria worked in harmony, their culinary styles complementing each other perfectly. Outside, Lucas, now healthy, helped serve the tables, his bright smile a constant reminder of the power of generosity and forgiveness. As the sun set over Bayview, bathing Seabreeze in a golden glow, it was clear that this small seaside town had learned a valuable lesson. Through trials and tribulations, they had rediscovered the true meaning of community, forgiveness, and new beginnings. And so, Seabreeze continued, not just as a restaurant, but as a symbol of what can happen when people choose understanding over judgment, forgiveness over resentment, and love over fear. Did you enjoy the story we shared today? If so, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or similar experiences. Share this story with your friends and family to spread the message of understanding and forgiveness. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, click the subscribe button to not miss our future inspiring stories. Turn on the notification bell to always be updated with new content. Let's rebuild bridges of understanding and